Hi everybody, it's Professor Michalsen. This lecture is going to focus on positivist and biological theories of crime. Last lecture we talked about classical and neoclassical theories of crime, which are really quite different. I'm going to be using the PowerPoint under course documents as sort of a loose guide, so if you want to follow along, please go ahead and do that. So just a few quick things that I'd like to talk about first. Positivism is not inherently a question of biological roots of crime. Positivism is the sort of a methodology, a way of thinking about data that quantifies it, that makes sure that we're measuring things. So where the classical criminologists were more armchair philosophers, the positivists are really focused on measuring behavior and characteristics, for example. So I'd like you to pay attention to that as you're going along. It's not just about biology, but also about measuring things and really sort of quantifying our data. So positivism is really quite different from the classical approach to criminology. It's sort of about as old compared to other theoretical traditions in criminology, but where the classical criminologists focused on choice, the question of choice and criminal behavior and how punishment therefore could affect people's choices, the positivists were focusing on the causes of criminal behavior, people's biology, people's psychology, how social environments come together. The early positivists were really focused on biology, and you'll see that in some sort of ways that are funny to us today. So the earliest of the positivists who focused on crime were people who focused on something called phrenology. And you may have heard of this, you may have seen images of a skull or a head that's sort of mapped out with areas. A scientist named Gall in the late 1700s and early 1800s mapped out how the sections of the brain, how areas of the brain affected people's criminal behavior. Now, this may sound a little bit familiar. Certainly we know today that the brain has sections that govern speech, for example, or facial recognition. What Gall was doing was more was sort of earlier than anything we know about now, but he mapped the brain and suggested that if someone had a bump on their skull, it indicated that that portion of the brain was overdeveloped, and that there were certain areas that governed criminal behavior, and that therefore if he felt your head, or another phrenologist felt your head, they would be able to tell whether you were going to commit crime or not. So that's Gall. The book has plenty on phrenology. Lombroso is another very, very important, I'm not going to call him the most important, but a really very important early criminologist. He was writing in the late 1800s. He wrote a book called L'uomo delinquente in Italian. He also was certainly one of the earliest criminologists to focus on women. He wrote another book called La donna delinquente, focusing on women's criminal behavior. The idea was that Lombroso had was that there were certain stigmata, he called them stigmata, physical characteristics that indicated that the person was atavistic. Atavistic means in fact, it was one of my SAT words that I remember studying. Atavistic means that you are a throwback to an earlier stage of human development, more like sort of a Neanderthal. And the idea was that people would be born criminals, and that you could tell that they were born a criminal by certain characteristics. And on the PowerPoint I have some photographs, drawings, that Lombroso used to demonstrate what people who were born criminals looked like. Now, some of these characteristics, and your book does a pretty good job of explaining these things as well. Characteristics might be big ears. They might be well-developed lips. Tattoos is one of the exceptions to things that you could be born with. Your chin or your jaw, your feet size and your hand size, all of these things Lombroso measured and said that he could correlate those characteristics with people's criminal behavior. Now, he had students, Raphael Garofalo, for example, that sort of went along with this, and then other students who disagreed, Ferry, for example, who said that it had more to do with psychological characteristics. Lombroso's ideas have since been proven wrong, certainly. But since then, there have been a whole number of criminologists. Houghton, for example, in the early 1900s, Kretschmer in the 1920s, who looked at body types. And in fact, my dad went to Yale, and in sort of over a number of years at all of the Ivy League institutions, they would make you get naked. And there's news stories about this. I put up a discussion board on Blackboard about it, where they discovered that researchers were taking photographs of naked undergraduate students to measure their body characteristics, to sort of prove that they were the non-criminal types. So these ideas aren't just, from Lombroso's time, from, 1876 or something like that. These are ideas that persisted well into the 20th century. So Kretschmer looked at body types. What I'd like you to do, and I've created a discussion board about this, I'd like you to think about how you would criticize early positivism. Everybody that I've talked about so far is considered to be early positivism. How would you critique that? What's the problem with these ideas? Okay? So take a look at this discussion board and critique it. What's the problem with how these people imagined criminals and the causes of criminal behavior? Now, today we talk about genetics. The idea isn't, well, it's very different in some ways, and it's not so different in others. The idea that what we were born with can determine, and that's an important word, can determine our behavior later. Vast amounts of research have been done sort of correlating genetics to everything from psychological disorders to our success in sort of the job world. So we already know that today people are talking about how we are determined to act, which again, remember, is so completely opposite of what the classical school and the neoclassical school is talking about. Neoclassical school takes biology and genetics into account far more than the classical school did. But just pay attention to the question of choice versus no choice here. And your book goes through a number of different topics that are related to genetics and crime, such as twin studies, adoption studies, XYY syndrome. And if you know anything about the Human Genome Project, it's a project to map the entire human genetic code. So the thing that I'd like you to think about, knowing what you know from your reading, I'd like you to think about how the question of genetics might affect our criminal justice system. Let's pretend that genes are shown to determine our behavior, that how we're going to act, whether or not we are going to commit crime, is hardwired into our genetic code. what does that mean for our criminal justice system? What changes might happen to our criminal justice system if that were to take place? Okay, so take a look at the discussion board and sort of play with that idea. So what if genetics governed everything? How would that change our system? Okay, now, as a part of that discussion board, I've put up a set of stories, and I'd like you to, give a read to at least one of them, and then have that affect your argument on the question of genetics and the criminal justice system. Now, there are many critiques of what's called neobiological positivism. The question of how many people are hardwired to commit crime and don't commit crimes is one thing that we haven't been able to answer. Second of all, studies haven't really used large sample sizes. Remember from our research methods lecture a few lectures ago that the more people that you have, the more power, and power is actually a technical term, you'll be able to have to speak about statistical differences between populations, between sort of subsamples. Also, people are very careful to talk about the fact that biology may play a role, but that social factors may are probably even more important. And some of those questions are in the articles that are up on the discussion boards. Now, as you go through your week or your next few days, I'd like you to pay attention to your eating. Seems to be a theme so far. I didn't mean for it to be that way. I'd like you to pay attention to what you eat and how it affects your behavior. And there's a discussion board up about this too. When you're hungry, how does that change your behavior? When you're full, how does that affect your behavior? When you eat certain things like sugar, or when you drink caffeine, or when you don't drink caffeine, how do all of those things affect your behavior? Monitor that for a little while and see how that goes for you for a day or 2 days or something like that, and then post up on the discussion board. And let's see, even if you're a very firm believer in something like choice or social factors, pay attention. Maybe food, and therefore your biology, probably, could also be social, but certainly biological to a certain extent, might affect your behavior, specifically thinking about maybe something like aggression or lack thereof. Okay? Your book also goes into the question of hormones and crime, which is certainly biological. There's a rather controversial discussion of PMS and crime and how women's hormones might affect their criminal behavior. One main problem with that lane of research is the fact that females really don't commit very much crime compared to males. It's one of the most consistent findings, as you'll remember from a few lectures ago. Aside from age, gender is a very good predictor of whether or not somebody will commit crime. So hormones being something else that might affect criminal behavior. And think about it too. What are the ages where people are most likely to commit crimes? Ages where hormones are really quite in flux. So the last thing that I have available for you on the PowerPoint is a set of videos about Joel Rifkin. And I have a discussion board up on Blackboard where you can discuss these different pieces of the video to talk about how biology might have played a role in his behavior. And then I'd like you to, again, to play that against the question of how classical and neoclassical theorists would talk about crime and how they might take issue with a biological perspective on this. All right? So, start thinking about your paper. All of the specs are up on Blackboard, and if you have any questions, you should please get in contact with me and email me, probably the best way, and we'll talk about it. All right? Take care, everybody.